Oh, Adam, you're on mute.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Lawrence, president of the Los Angeles chapter. Welcome tonight. We have a great presentation for you, and then we'll have a question and answer. And then after that, we'll talk a moment about our upcoming event. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Monica.
Oh, well, before Monica,
Sorry,
I'm just gonna pop in. No worries, Adam. Thank you. I'm Kimmy. Hello, everyone. I am the West Region Development Assistant with the Foundation Fighting Blindness. We're so excited to be with you all tonight, and thank you for sharing your evening with us. Before we start tonight's call, I just want to share some quick research updates and news from the Foundation. So first we have Etsena has announced the advancement of its phase 1/2 X-linked retinoschisis gene therapy clinical trial. They've dosed the first 9 adult patients, determined the optimal treatment dose, and plan to treat another 9 adults and 3 kids. In May 2024, the company reported excellent results for the first 3 patients who received the low dose. Excitingly, we have another emerging Stargardt disease therapy for ABCA4 mutations that have been authorized by the FDA to move into a clinical trial. The Regeneron is using an innovative approach called mRNA transplicing. This forthcoming trial becomes the 7th for Stargardt disease. The others are from Alkeus, Belite Bio, Nanoscope, Ocugen, Acidian, and Splice Bio, with many more on the way. And finally, Splice Bio is poised to launch a clinical trial for a protein splicing treatment for people with Stargardt disease. What's cool is this is the first protein splicing treatment for any condition to receive FDA authorization to move into a human study. So that's all the updates I have from the Foundation. I'll pass it over to Monica to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Hello, my name is Monica, and it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alfredo Sadun. He is a world-renowned expert in neuro-ophthalmology. Dr. Sadun is dedicated to understanding and treating diseases that affect the optic nerve and vision. He serves as chief at Doheny Eye Institute and is vice chair of ophthalmology at UCLA. He earned his MD PhD from Albert Einstein College of Medicine after graduating from MIT. Dr. Sadun's career is marked by groundbreaking achievements, from uncovering how Alzheimer's disease affects the eye and furthering our understanding of mitochondria's role in genetic diseases like LON, as well as in nutritional and toxic optic neuropathies. His research has helped save the sight of thousands, including leading efforts to stop an epidemic of optic nerve disease in Cuba. His contributions have earned him numerous prestigious awards, which you can also find on his Wikipedia page. Beyond his scientific impact, Dr. Sadun is a compassionate physician and an exceptional teacher who has shaped the future of ophthalmology worldwide. Today, he's here to share his expertise and insights with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alfredo Sadun.
Thank you, Monica. That was a lovely introduction. I really enjoyed it. It's a shame my wife isn't behind me to hear it. Anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad to talk to you. What I thought we could do for about 15 or 20 minutes is talk about this disease that Monica calls LON, L-H-O-N. Not because of the scientific basis of it, but because of the drama and how it causes bilateral sudden blindness, which is a good model for how people also deal with the blindness and how they best adapt to it. One of the things about this disease is that I've been in it so long, I'm an old man now, that I've accumulated a huge registry of patients who have it, and that includes the majority of patients in the United States who have LHON. So that's a lot of experience that has allowed us to do some interesting types of studies. Now, LHON is a genetic disease, so is Stargardt's and a lot of retinitis pigmentosa. But what's unusual about it are 2 things. One is that the gene that you get, it comes from mitochondria. And the mitochondria come from the egg. So the genetics is unbelievably simple. If the mother has it, all the kids are going to have it. If the father has it, none of the kids are going to have it. It only travels down the maternal line. That can lead to some rather interesting psychological aspects because mothers tend to be sometimes very guilt-ridden. As absurd as that is, nobody has control over what genes they give to their kids. But it's an aspect of what I have to tell the parents and the kids. The second is that it is, unlike all the other degenerations, extremely abrupt. About 50% of boys who inherit the gene and about 15% of the girls that inherit the gene are going to go blind. which is also very unusual because it's not a certain thing. The majority of people with the genes continue to see 20/20 perfectly well all their lives. But if you're going to go blind, you do so about age 20 in a dramatic fashion. One day, the vision is just really bad in one eye, and over the next couple of weeks, you lose almost all your vision, all your useful vision. And then about a month later, the same thing happens to the other eye. So within a couple of months, you are now profoundly bilaterally blind right at the prime of your life. I'll give one example of how this plays out. This was a young man who was in high school, made the golf team, got on a golf scholarship to go to a university. His life just seemed to be perfect for him. In his first year in college, perhaps precipitated by smoking and drinking, which can be the trigger, he lost vision in both eyes. Went through a grueling few months where nobody knew what it was. MRIs, brain tumors, MS were all on the table. But after spending weeks in the hospital to figure out what it was, he finally got sent to a neuro-ophthalmologist. This is a slam dunk diagnosis. It's really very easy because of several features. So he came to see me, and he was now profoundly bilaterally blind in both eyes. But we told him that many other people, and by the way, there's a community of people, and they learn best from each other, that a number of people with this disease did not alter their life. And so he decided to stay in college, and various members of his fraternity signed up to always take the courses he did so that they could accompany him to class, take notes for him. And he ended up doing very well. He graduated, and then he discovered blind golf, and he's now the world's #1 blind golfer, has won the British Journal of the British Open. So there are ways of adapting to it, and he's an excellent example of how it can be made to work. One of the things that we did is a study to find out what were the factors that made, unfortunately, some of our patients commit suicide, what made for the tremendous depression, and what could we learn about the depression, and what was the factors that rescued them from the depression. And I'll tell you right now that one of the best things is to lose your vision at a younger age. And one of the worst things is to lose your vision at an older age. The ones who lost vision at 16 or 17 did really well. And the ones who lost vision at 28 and 29, not so much. One of the features of the patients who did very badly are those who had unrealistic expectations. We had a recent clinical trial of gene therapy, and I think it did a great deal of harm. It did help a little bit in some patients, but they entered the trial reading the PR that this was going to be a cure for their disease. And once you've had damage to the optic nerve, nothing's going to cure you. It's just going to abate and mitigate it. And so while there are medications and this gene therapy trial that, let's say, takes the edge off and allows for a small improvement in vision, it's not dramatic. But the PR of this company led them to think that it was going to be, and that was a great shame because these patients have permanently done rather poorly because of their mindset. If you let the denial stage last too long, I don't think that you march through the stages of grief appropriately and get to where you should be. One of the things that we did was a study to ask who did the patients see as their primary source of information and counseling. And it was rather interesting. The patients who did the best in terms of their psychological scale, and we had a psychiatrist who had several instruments of measuring psychological function that we were able to employ. The ones who did best, first of all, didn't do great the first year. They ended up doing great the second year. You've got to be patient enough to get through the stages of grief of the first year. But the ones who did best had a neuro-ophthalmologist. Next best were those who had optometrists, which is unusual because optometrists didn't know a lot about this disease. Next best was neurologists, and next best ophthalmologists, and so on down the scale. It was rather disappointing to find out that the absolute worst were genetic counselors. Genetic counselors know a great deal of subtleties about autosomal dominant, recessive, but not so much about mitochondrial disease, and they knew nothing about the clinical features of this disease. So what I took away as my lesson is the more you can explain what the nature of the disease is, and even give the patients a language to describe. I tell the patients, for example, it's not that your visual acuity is poor like in other diseases. People won't understand that part. But if you tell them that if you've got mild diseases like walking through life with a softball in front of your eye, if you got moderate disease that becomes a basketball, and if it's advanced disease, it becomes a beach ball. That worked out very well because then they could explain why they could run around the room and bounce around easily because their peripheral vision told them where they were in the room. But when they were trying to, see anything like choosing the right bus or even walking in unfamiliar terrain, they couldn't do very well with a big black beach ball right in front of them. So giving them a language to describe is helpful. And many other things that give them insights as to what's going on is helpful. And the optometrists didn't know that much about it, but they did look it up. And they had enough time to do that, as opposed to the ophthalmologists that tended to refer it out or not deal with it at all. So information is power, and self-empowering. And the patients who had this did much, much better. I think at this point I'm going to pause and ask if there's any area here that would be useful for the group in terms of questions and answers. But the psychological, I know one more thing I wanted to add. The young people did so much better than the older people for two reasons. One is because they're more adaptable and were able to make good choices in terms of education and profession without being overwhelmed by that. But there was another reason, and it's because moms were involved. And the mom is an amazingly effective support system here. And when they were 18, they had a mom involved, and when they were 28, much less so. I'm not saying that girlfriends and wives weren't helpful, but nothing was as good as the mom. At that point, why don't I pause and see if there's any other questions that the group here would have me address? If not, I'll ramble on my own.
Doctor, this is Sherry. I find that really interesting, and I'm wondering, is there anything a non-mom, whether it would be a partner, wife, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, could possibly do that moms are doing to sort of mimic, I suppose, the support?
That's a great question. Let me give a real life example. One of my patients who ended up doing really well in the end, but was quite depressed in the beginning, was sleeping in later and later every day. And finally, the mom comes to him and says, at 12 o'clock, you're up and at him. And he says, but I hate that. I can't see anything. I can't do anything. He says, well, what are you seeing and doing in your bedroom? He says, sleeping. But when I sleep, I dream. And when I dream in vivid images and color. And when the real world forces me to recognize that it's all blurry and in black and white, it's no good. Clearly, he was in denial, and getting out of denial was necessary. And getting out in the real world was something the mom was able to bully him into doing that was extremely helpful. I think the other thing that helped this young man, this is the same guy that I was telling about, was his friends. They were incredibly effective because they partnered with him to give him enough support to get him back into the real world, but not alone. So one of the things that they did was attend classes. Another thing they did was take him on lots of bike rides. So he got a bicycle built for two. Different people took turns being in the front and guiding the bike, but he worked in the back and worked up a good sweat and felt that he was making his contributions on very long bike rides. Eventually, this evolved into where about a dozen of these guys would sign people up to make contributions for research by miles, and they would start in Santa Barbara and bicycle down to San Diego with him taking the lead. And this is a very positive event where they were actually doing something for the next generation of people who were going to get this diagnosis.
That was helpful. So basically, get the person to get up out of bed, up off the couch, whatever it takes, support it, but maybe make plans and say we're going.
Just so. And I guess it's a partnership that his fraternity brothers did, that moms will often do, which says, I'll give you some help, but it's going to involve risk on your side too. Risk and work.
Hi, this is Adam. I have a really quick question. As far as preparedness, I mean, do you talk to your patients about things like Braille and computers and all that stuff? Or is
Yeah, I
that-
used to do more of it when it was more useful. In the old days, we always sent these patients to the Braille Institute or some other low vision clinic, and they would obviously select amongst a number of different tools, depending upon their own particular needs and their own level of vision. The patients with Leber's vary like other diseases, from profoundly blind to completely blind. But I have to say that the tools that have become available electronically since then, in the last 5 or 10 years, have been so good that we've tended to recommend some of the specific tools and not Braille. First of all, in labors, they always retain a small ring of peripheral vision. So a cane and a dog is rarely useful. Once in a while, it's so bad that it is, but more often than not, they don't have to have that. They certainly can't read, so Braille might be useful. But now with electronic tools, they've figured out ways to get around that quite often. One of them involves magnification electronically. The reason magnification doesn't work by itself is if you had lenses that magnified your center, you'd be magnifying the very part you can't see. That baseball would become a beach ball, and it would be much, much worse for them. But the electronic magnification have tricks where they magnify things only a little bit, but put a little bubble in your vision, and wherever you aim the bubble with your goggles gets magnified, and so they can end up magnifying the part on the side and not straight ahead and do much more with it. The other thing that sounds silly but really was effective is when I'm sorry, I'm having a mental senior moment. Apple came out with its instrument that allows you to pinch and expand things. And it's not the phone, it's the iPad. That's what I was looking for. And the iPad turns out to be fantastically useful. Students take it, aim the camera at the blackboard, expand it, and then look at the corner, not straight ahead, to be able to see the parts that they want to see where straight ahead is blocked out. Certainly people who go shopping find that they can read price tags using a similar trick. And then finally, there are AI interpretations that can be done on your iPhone or your iPad, mostly the iPhone, that will, as you aim and show this, announce to you verbally, you are looking at a middle-aged woman of approximately 45 and she looks happy, which is very useful to them to have some idea of the stranger that's approaching them. Moreover, they can then tell the person, oh, that's my cousin Betty. And the next time it'll say, you're looking at your cousin Betty, and it'll identify it for you. And that's available free of charge through an app that I think is called, I'll look it up right now. Seeing AI, SEEING AI. And it will also read barcodes for you. It'll also, of course, read text for you. And so this free app will do a lot of the things that used to be available through low vision.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions before we let the doctor continue? All right, take it away.
Well, I'll just go on to say that I spend a tremendous amount of time talking to the patients. Maybe it's also to appease my guilt because we don't have effective medication. But these patients come to me and get about an hour spiel and then another hour of answering their questions. And I encourage them to bring all the members of their family with them when they have that appointment for two reasons. One is because everybody hears half of what I say, and put together they get a whole lot of it. The other one is that the members can really use some of the advice. In the case of labors, we talk about the importance of not smoking and drinking, which would aggravate the little bit of vision they have. And best of all is going to be the siblings who carry the same mutation but haven't lost vision yet. And if they take preventive measures, it goes a lot further than waiting for the vision loss to occur. They may never get to the point of triggering their visual loss. We went down to Brazil, where the world's largest recorded family with labors exists, 362 people. And down there, we would every year put together an hour lecture about what sort of risk factors to avoid. The interesting thing to me is that after 2 or 3 or 4 trips, they would receive me always with a great deal of affection and respect, but sort of demanding, saying, have you come up with a pill that's going to cure me yet? And I would say to them, I've come up with a strategy that's going to help you. They didn't want that. They wanted a blue pill that would fix things simply. But when we first arrived, the frequency of men going blind was 55%. And after 20 years, that had gone down to 25%. That means half the people that were going to go blind didn't go blind because of these preventive measures, which to me may not be as dramatic as a blue pill, but is a profound change in the circumstances.
Actually, could you talk a little bit about those preventive measures? Like, what exactly does that entail?
I'm sorry, I have a little audio problem. Could you speak a little slower?
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about those preventive measures that you talked about, where you had a 25, or 50% success rate? Like, what does that mean exactly?
Sure. Well, in the case of labors, there are three aggravating factors. I should start off with my very first phrase when I walk in and start telling them, I say, you have a genetic defect, but while the gene is necessary, it's not sufficient to cause vision loss. What tips the balance, therefore, is something environmental. And the three most likely environmental factors are one, smoke, not just smoking, but smoke. When there were the Paradise fires up in Northern California, a half dozen patients carrying the gene went blind within a short period of time. We recently had these fires in Southern California. I expect the usual lag time of 6 weeks before they show up in my clinic. There'll be a handful of those as well. But smoking, tobacco, cigars, any form of tobacco, cigarettes and pipes, or smoke. So we had, for example, identical twins who not only share the gene, but share all the other genes as well. One of whom became a firefighter and went blind, and the other one didn't, because as a non-firefighter, he's avoided smoke. The second is alcohol. A little bit of alcohol doesn't matter, but if you go over a threshold, which depending upon a person's size and gender might be 2 or 3 drinks, then you produce a chemical which can stimulate this vision loss. So we explain to them how critically important it is, usually not to have any alcohol. I have a few patients who insist that they can have a glass of wine with every meal and not ever overdo it. And that's true usually amongst the older ones. But 18-year-olds don't know themselves that well. And so sometimes they discover the hard way that one glass of wine leads to them feeling relaxed enough for a second glass, leads to them feeling that it really doesn't matter and only that night in front of them does. And then they get drunk and then they have a setback. This third risk factor is a class of antibiotics that kill bacteria that are similar to mitochondria, which is the nature of this disease. So we give them a list of those 6 antibiotics. They fold it up and put it in their wallet. And then if they ever go to the emergency room and get diagnosed with a disease that requires them to be on antibiotics, they check it against the list. The good news is that if you take a week or 2 of the wrong antibiotic, it won't matter. But after a month or 2, it would. So by then they've figured it out, or if they've lost the slip, they write to us and we give them a new one. But those 3 things, I think, allow the person to avoid about half the risk of going blind. And I think that in addition to the most important part, which is they don't go blind half the time, is the empowerment again of people feeling that they have some control over their own circumstances. It's not a completely passive, helpless situation where they have nothing to do.
I have a question. Are there any other diseases similar where related to vision that are triggered by these environment or I guess that are present in people's DNA but can be triggered by these environmental factors?
I think that no disease comes close to labors for how important these environmental factors are, because the gene brings you so close to threshold. But the reality is that this particular class of diseases that affect mitochondria, which there are many, the environment can harm your mitochondria, and so can the genetics. And that even includes diseases like macular degeneration. I'm sure you've known that about 10 years ago, they discovered that smoking not only causes lung cancer and heart disease, but it raises your risk of macular degeneration twofold. So while the ratio isn't quite as strong towards environment as in the diseases that I've been talking about, there are several diseases that affect mitochondria for which the same 3 things should be avoided. Now, in macular degeneration, they haven't done the study, but I will certainly make the prediction that those 6 antibiotics that we've identified that affect mitochondria will also cause macular degeneration to occur in greater number.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, could you please tell us what those medications are?
Sure. These are antibiotics, all of them. And antibiotics kill bacteria. And bacteria were the source of our mitochondria about 1 billion years ago. So if they affect the chemistry of the bacteria in a way that's been preserved by evolution, then they're very bad for people who have mitochondrial disease. And specifically, the worst of these antibiotics is something called ethambutol, which is used for tuberculosis. Another one that has a very powerful effect is called linezolid, which is used to treat patients who have strep-resistant diseases. There are a couple of others, and they are the aminoglycosides, of which gentamicin is the biggest example, and chloramphenicol. Those are probably the most important four.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
I had a quick question. Would Stargardt's, does that also follow under the mitochondrial disease?
Well, the textbook says no. However, the similarities between Stargardt's and macular degeneration are great enough, and I did look into that question. Nobody's done the proper studies on these risk factors, so I'm not sure. It's probably the fairest way of putting it, but it would not surprise me if there wasn't some aggravation of Stargardt progression that occurred if you had these three risk factors. You know, even Alzheimer's disease is now being shown to have some mitochondrial basis. So those three risk factors are probably things to avoid at almost all costs. 10 years ago, they told you that if you drank moderately, there was no risk to it at all. And now we realize every drink has some risk to it. So the world is coming to realize that there's bigger dangers in alcohol, and especially in smoke, and in these three antibiotics, antibiotic types than we used to think. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize that we touched on but didn't talk at length on is the difficulty that comes when expectations are inappropriate. One of the things that always sets me back and makes it really hard for me to treat my patients is when they send a patient who has labors off to me and says, listen, you're really bad and you're blind in both eyes, but we figured out what it is. And don't worry, Dr. Sadun's doing so much research that within a few months he'll come up with a cure. Obviously, I hate two parts of that. One is the word cure gives by itself unreasonable expectations. And two is it's not true. We don't have a good treatment for labors. And it's not just that I have to disappoint the patient by saying that. It sets back the whole level of trust in the medical establishment, the effect on the patient on trying to engage the new reality. Everything is set back. And so I would really tell my fellow physicians, be careful about not exaggerating about how good treatment is going to be. I think patients can tolerate the truth. Maybe not immediately in the first 5 minutes, but eventually.
I came in late, so if this is repeated information, please forgive me. Does RP, retinitis pigmentosa, come under the same as the mitochondrial,
Yeah, good question. A simple answer, no. RP involves one of a few different enzymes that allow for the proper reproduction of rhodopsin. And initially, it slows down the rhodopsin production. Then eventually, it kills the very cells that need rhodopsin to function, the rods and cones. And so whether it be the traditional RP or rod cone dystrophy or some variant of it, that's a different concept altogether. I'm not suggesting that a person with RP should smoke, drink, or take these antibiotics, but it's a different story.
Thank you.
Surely.
Well, in that same vein, is there anything a person with RP should avoid that you know of?
Well, I'll answer that, but it should be first considered that I'm an expert on labors, but I'm not an expert in RP. And so that's a question that certainly should be repeated at least to your RP specialist. But the answer is all those things that cause retinal stress. And what most of all causes retinal stress is a bright blue light. So it's probably important for RP patients to not go out to a beach, not to be in the midday sun, and certainly to wear sunglasses whenever appropriate, because bright light will force these cells to work extra hard at the very time that they're trying to hang on to work at all.
Thank you. Does that also include light from a computer?
First of all, no. Computer light is much, I mean, by 1,000 times less powerful than a bright sunlight. Secondly, what really matters is blue light, not red light. And so it might be worthwhile asking some computer maven, because it can be done, to change the color balance in the computer to lessen the blue light, and then you really will feel good about things.
I have blue light blocking glasses.
Perfect. That's
Okay.
just what you want.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate
Surely.
all your answers.
The other disadvantage of blue light is if you happen to be using the computer or your iPad or your phone in the evening, because our circadian rhythm uses blue light to tell us that it's midday or close to it. And you won't sleep well after exposing yourself to a lot of blue light in the evening. And so things like Kindles have built-in choices where you can block the blue and use an amber light instead. And so it is with an iPhone. And in your case, it would be a better reason to do that altogether.
Oh, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Hi, it's Adam again. Quick question. As far as collaborating and communicating with other eye care professionals, do you have like a group that talks about these kinds of things for their patients so that, you know, others, again, with someone who's seen a client with RP or a client with AMD or something like that could, you know, get the information you're talking about, not related to the specific disease you're working on, but just the eye disease in general. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
I think so. First of all, I'm going to answer a question you did not ask. I forgot to, and that's what reminded me that your question did. There are these support groups. In the case of labors, it's lhon.org that are fantastic because they're filled with people writing in little tricks. You know, how to get my kid to get to the front of the classroom so that he doesn't fall behind. All these little things that I would never know how to do. The moms figure it out and they pass it on one to the other. And most of my patients tell me that it's just the most useful thing to have these support groups. But to your question, you weren't asking about LHON, you're asking for low vision in general. And I don't know of any support group for low vision in general. That's a good idea, though.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And
Basically,
I'm wondering whether if you contacted the support group for lhon.org, I happen to know the person who runs that. Her name is Julie, and raised with her the idea that there might be a part of it that deals not with the disease, but with the consequence of the disease of low vision that might be accessible for people with other diseases. She might be very willing to do that. I think it's a good idea.
okay, great. I guess my question though is more about the eye care professionals kind of communicating with each other to share information, kind of like what you're talking about, so that when they get a patient who comes in, whether newly diagnosed or trying to cope, you know, in mid disease, let's say, do you folks all kind of share, here's my idea, sort of what you're talking about, that you tell them about?
Let me start off by saying it's a great sin of physicians they don't talk to each other. So overall, the problem is very great, and I wish I could say better. But
Okay.
there is one exception to that, and that is what we do at Grand Rounds. So about 3 or 4 times a year, I'll give a talk at Grand Rounds, and I'll share all my tricks to all the other physicians. And then other times of the year, somebody else will do what little I just told you about retinitis pigmentosa. I've learned at Grand Rounds from world experts in retinitis pigmentosa. So there's the sharing that goes on. But who attends the Grand Rounds? Half of the academics and very, very few people in private practice.
That's sad.
It is. And I started off by apologizing for the profession because I think we do a really poor job of communicating with each other. Now, the papers that we write and publish are the way we communicate, but those are formal. Those show scientific evidence of certain important principles, but that doesn't include what we would call in the field clinical pearls, which is what you're talking about. Just little tricks and little advantages and insights that we have. So papers are a good way of learning about the science, but not a good way of learning about the art of the medicine.
Did
I
you
guess
call?
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I was just saying, it sounds like everybody needs to communicate more, but you've already said they don't. So.
Not much.
Did you call them clinical pearls?
Yes.
Oh, that's
That's
so
our-
wonderful.
Yeah,
That's
that's our
wonderful.
jargon for what you're talking about, clinical pearls.
That's great.
Example, recently I heard a talk on retinitis pigmentosa, and clearly you can't do much about the gene defect in the rods and cones and RPE cells dying. But the person there said, listen, at the medium, not for the mild patient, not for the severe patient, but for the middle of the process of the disease, there's also swelling. And swelling is accumulation of fluid that makes everything blurry on top of everything else. If you give them Diamox, you get Diamox is a diuretic. You get rid of the swelling, and they get back 2 lines of vision. That's a clinical pearl. That's not a study. It's not a piece of science. It doesn't deal with the most fundamental parts of the disease. But it's extremely useful to give these patients back a year or 2 of vision in the middle of their course with this simple medication.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. It sounds like we've wound down. Thank you very much for having honored me to speak to you. The questions were absolutely superb.
Thank you for
So
coming.
much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Before we close out, Shauna, would you like to talk to everyone about our upcoming event in March?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. So in March, we're going to have a community connections on March 18th at 7:30 p.m. We're going to distribute a notification from the FFB, but we're so excited. We're going to have Deborah Erickson from the Blind Kitchen as our presentation speaker. She's a culinary school graduate and she's a former cooking instructor for blind and visually impaired adults. She's going to talk to us and, to relay how someone with vision loss can still cook safely, confidently, and independently with the right adaptive tools and techniques. So we hope all of you will join us for the March 18th meeting.
Thank you very much, Shauna. And thanks everybody for coming tonight. We hope you'll join us for our next event.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Thank
week.
you, doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.